Welcome back to the channel. My name is Tronage, and today we are going to be talking about Betaflight. And you know it's going to be serious when I got the Britney Spears mic on. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about today is really hooking up the HGLRC XJB 145 into Betaflight, getting it set up, and getting you in the air. So, stay tuned. Alright, so a lot of you, I noticed in the comments, were having some either difficulty or never did it before of hooking up Betaflight because this may have been your first quad that you picked up. So I figured, you know what, let me make a video how to go through and do a step-by-step. Now, let me first put a little disclaimer up here saying that there is more than one way to skin a cat. This is just the way I set things up, and these are the settings that I like to play with and tinker with. Joshua Bardwell has an excellent series about all of Betaflight and all the different intricacies of it. I'm hoping to produce this as more of a follow-along step-by-step so you can follow along while you're setting up your quad. And it doesn't only have to be this particular quad. You can look at this as more like a just general guide of Betaflight itself. So, first, you need Betaflight. Now, I'm not going to go through the process of how to download a program and install a program on your software, but I'm going to put the link in the description below of where you can download the latest version standalone of the Betaflight app. So if you don't already have Betaflight, go in the links below, click the link, it'll bring you to the page where you can download it, find your operating system that you're using, click the link, download it, and install it depending on what operating system you're using. So I'm going to go through what I do, so you can follow along at home if you wish, but this is what I like to do. The first thing you have to do is you have to plug in your quad. Without having your quad plugged in, you can't connect to it. So I'm going to use a normal USB plug here, and I'm going to remove my little USB protector that I have over my outlet so I don't get grass juice in there, and I'm going to plug in my USB cord. The moment I do that, you'll see this starts to come alive a little bit, and you'll notice in the upper right hand corner now, this is now changed. Now yours may not say COM3 because it's basically setting it up. Now, if you have any kind of issue or problem where you go to plug it in and it doesn't show a COM port, or later on when I'll show it again when we go to make sure we're running the latest version of the firmware, there's another piece of software that you may be interested in getting. And it's this one called the Impulse RC. It's basically their driver fixer. And if you notice when I ran it, it's doing this whole little process to install certain drivers and stuff like that. And you can use that to make sure that you'll be able to connect to your quad. You'll also be able to use that to flash your firmwares. And I should be good to go here. So I see up here it says COM3, and I can click connect. So when I click connect, it's going to do a whole little thing. And now it's showing a representation of my quad on the screen. As you can see, as I move my quad in real life, the quad on the screen moves. It's basically using the gyros and the accelerometers and all that fun goodness inside to get a feeling of where it is in space, essentially. And then we have a bunch of options down here along the side. Now, if you notice up here, we'll start with this. I have Enable Expert Mode turned on. And you should turn that on too. It just means more options are going to appear over here on the left side. If I turn it off, it makes some things disappear, and you turn it on, more things will appear. So if I'm clicking on things over here on the left side that you don't have, just go over here and enable the expert mode. So the first thing that I ever do when I get a brand new quad and I plug it into Betaflight for the first time and I've hit connect is I click over here on the CLI. And what this is it's essentially like a console where you can type commands in and it'll spit responses back at you. And the things that I do first before I do anything else is I first type version and hit enter. And when I do that, it's going to kick back to me what version of the firmware is running on the quad right now. So you can see on this quad, since I've already updated it relatively recently. You'll see I'm running an Omnibus F4, and it's running target 3.2.2, which was released on November 11th, 2017. That's good information to know because we want to update the firmware, so we're going to see if there's anything newer than that, but we need to know specifically what's on it before we start trying to update it. The next thing I do is I want to make sure I have a copy of the way it's set up right now in case I screw anything up, in case I click something wrong. I want to be able to return it back to where it is right now. And the way you can do that is you type this. You type DUMP and you hit enter. And it's going to basically dump all the settings that are currently configured for this quad. Now you saw it went flying off the screen. You're not going to read through it right now, but what you can do is you can click and highlight and go all the way up, and you can copy and paste it, or you can just come over here to where it says save to file, and you can click that. So when you click that, it'll bring up a dialog box just like this, and you can see I've already made it, so it's going to be saving it into a folder called HGLRC XJB 145 CLI, and it's going to give it this default name, which yours may be different, but that whatever, you just give it a name and it's a text file, and you can hit save. Later on, if you need to return any of these settings, I'll show you how you can basically copy and paste these settings back into the CLI, and then you save them and it sets those settings for you. So this is basically first step to backing things up. Now that we back things up, now let's go see if there's a new version of our firmware to update to before we do any kind of settings or anything. So we're going to go back to disconnect. So because we know we were running Omnibus F4 version 3.2.2, before I do anything else, I'm going to check to see if there's any new version of the firmware, because you may want to just leave it as is and not mess with this, and that's perfectly fine. I, on the other hand, as you know, I like to mod things, I like to edit things, I like to change things. And I also, one of the other things I do is I like to have the latest and greatest of whatever's available. So I like making sure that my quads are all running the latest and greatest firmwares for whatever their target is. So I'm going to check if there's a firmware before we go to update the firmware. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So now that I'm on this main screen here, I'll just go over here where it says Firmware Flasher. And I have this already selected to be an Omnibus F4. And now I'm going to click here to see if there's any firmwares, and I see there is. So you see the version we were running came out on November 11th, 2017. A new version, 3.2.3, came out on December 11th, a month later. And you see now there's a 3.2.4 version that came out this year on January 10th. I'll be updating this live for you guys just as well. So now that I know that there is an update, can't always do it directly through this console. You have to put your quad into DFU mode. I'm going to show you how to do that, not just for the HGLRC XJB, but for any quad. Some of them may have a boot button inside that you can get to somewhere where you can push the boot button down and plug in a battery, or if you have a smoke stopper, you push the boot button and flip it on. An easier way to do it without having to open anything up or hold any buttons or do anything with that is we'll connect back to the quad, we'll go into the CLI, and the command we're going to issue here is BL for bootloader. We'll hit enter. And you see now it kicked me out, and it's now on the top where it had the COM port, it now says DFU, which means now the quad is set up to accept a firmware. So we'll go back to Firmware Flasher. We have it set as the Omnibus F4. If you're not doing it on this particular quad, you're doing it on a different quad. That's why we typed version in the beginning, so you know what you're looking for. Do not put a firmware on your quad that's not what was already there. So you may have a different firmware when you typed version. Match it up. Find the type of firmware you're using, and then find the latest version of that firmware that you're using. And now we'll go to the 3.2.4 target. And then on the bottom here where it says load firmware online, we'll click that. And what it did there is it's going to download it from the internet. So now I have that firmware loaded onto my computer. And now I'm going to click flash firmware. And what this is doing now is this is loading it from my computer onto the quad. And you see what it did there is it basically erased the old firmware that was on there. And now it's flashing it on. So we'll speed this up a little bit. Now again, if you have some issues and you try to put this in bootloader mode and you're not getting that DFU in the corner, and it's basically the USB drivers kind of get all screwy, and they kind of use different ones. As I mentioned earlier, there is this piece of software here, the Impulse RC, and you see it's putting my quad into DFU mode because it's basically found the quad, it's setting it up, it's doing what it needs to do and setting the drivers to put it into DFU mode. So you can see if you run into any kind of problems with your drivers and the quad's not reading into Betaflight, run that software. It should auto-fix itself and put you where you need to be. Now I'm going to get out of DFU mode by just unplugging the quad and then plugging it back in. The next step I like to do is I like to make sure the firmware for my ESCs is updated as well. And for that I use a piece of software called BL-Heli Configurator. And here's what it looks like. And you see it looks very similar to Betaflight. Now the one difference is in order for my ESCs to be powered up, you do have to have a battery attached to your quad. Now, if I was a good boy, I'd be taking my props off now, because when you're indoors and stuff, you don't want to be attaching a battery pack to your quad with the props on. However, I'm going to live on the edge. But at home, take your props off. Don't be lazy. Now my ESCs are toned on, so I know that they're going to be online when I go to connect here. So I'm going to connect. And then what I'm going to do is read setup. And now it's showing me along the side here the 4 ESCs. And the important thing to take note of is that they're running FH40 16.7. This is the version number, the 16.7. And the FH40 is essentially like an identifier. You do not want to ever change that. So we're going to keep that the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the flash all, because I want to flash all 4 ESCs. And I'm going to leave this the same, FH40. Don't need to touch that. But I'm going to check the version. Is there a new version? And the answer is there's not a new version. 16.7 is the same version I was running, and that's the current version. So there's no need to update anything. If you did need to update something, you'd click your version that you wanted to update to, and you'd click flash. But since I am running 16.7 already, then there's no reason to update anything here, so we don't need to do that. Now for just safety, I'm going to unplug my battery once again so that I know my ESCs are powered down. I don't have to worry about them. So now we're back to Betaflight, and we're going to do connect again. Now this first page, like I was showing you, is where you can play with your quad, and you want to make sure that everything kind of makes sense when you tilt it to the, it may not line up. Like right now the quad's pointing at me, but the screen is pointing away. It doesn't know necessarily where it is via compass per se. So that part may not work. But you want to make sure that when you tilt it left, it goes left. When you tilt it right, it goes right. When you tilt it forward, it tips forward. Back, it tips back. The next thing you can do is you want to click here where it says calibrate accelerometer. But you don't want to do that while it's laying on the table all crooked. This has a battery strap that doesn't allow it to sit straight. My table surface is probably not straight. So you don't want to just calibrate your accelerometer and not already have it on a level surface. So the best way to set up a level surface is you get yourself like a piece of wood or something, and you take 2 levels and you place them at right angles to each other. This way you can see left and right level, and you can see front and back level. And what you want to do is you just adjust it. You can put little pieces of paper underneath to raise and lower it. You can use little wedges of wood or spacers or whatever you want to do to essentially level that plank of wood. And once you do that, you want to make sure you remove any battery straps. This has this zip tie with the battery connector here. You want to clip that off. You want to make sure that anything that would be on this surface is gone, so you have a flat surface here. And you want to put it on your flat surface so you know everything is level. And then you can click calibrate accelerometer. That's the goal. A little bit of a pain, but it does help you out in the long run. Then we're going down here to ports. So you can see now, because I flash a new firmware, everything's been essentially wiped out because of the new firmware, because I don't have anything set up to be a receiver on this. So what I'm going to do is, this is why we backed up with that dump command earlier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that back up, and I'm going to show you how to reinsert that in. So all my settings and everything are put back onto this quad. So as we go through the different menu systems, instead of, I can just show you it already set up. And this will also show you how to restore your settings when you do update firmwares after you've been using your quad. So in order to do this, we're going to open up the file we saved earlier, which I have right here. And then you see it has name and resources and all that stuff. So starting with name right here, I am just going to grab everything. I'm going to hit copy. I'm going to Betaflight. And by copy, I mean Control-C on a Windows. You know, whatever it is on Mac, I'm sorry, I don't know. But whatever you do to copy something to the clipboard. And then we'll go back to the CLI here. We'll click down in the command area, and I'm going to hit paste, which is Control-V. And it doesn't look like I pasted anything, but actually there's a whole bunch of stuff I pasted. You only see the last line of it. And then I'm going to hit enter. And what it did there is it just re-injected everything that I saved settings back into the quad, but it didn't save them. It just sent them to the quad. Now the quad has them, but if I was to disconnect right now, or if I was to click anywhere else off of this screen, those settings would get lost. So it's not until you type save, S-A-V-E, and you hit enter, that it's now saving those to the quad essentially. Now we can go back in here to connect, and we can go under ports, and now you can see now things that I had set up are back the way they should be set up. So for this quad, UART1, which is essentially like a communication port. What it means for, again, this is more just to follow along, not to necessarily explain the technicalities behind anything. But essentially UART1 is what we want set up as a serial RX, meaning our serial receiver is plugged in to port 1. That's what this is telling the flight controller, so it knows where our receiver is located. And that's the only thing you have to really do on this screen, is just toggle this switch on. Then you'd hit save and reboot. I don't need to do that because it's already saved and I'm not changing anything. But anytime you do anything on a screen, make sure you hit the save button in the bottom right corner before you move on to the next tab. Now configuration. We're running it's a quad X, basically it's an X-shaped quad. It shows you the motor order, and you see that I have my motors reversed. Yours may not be reversed. I'm running mine so my motors spin towards the sides. Most run so they spin towards the fronts. But the reason why I change it personally is because where I fly is a lot of grass, and I end up in the grass for landings or in inverted landings. And when you do that, if they're spinning towards the camera, if you look at the proximity of the propellers and the lens of your camera, you notice they're pretty much level with each other. So if this comes through and chops any grass, that grass juice is going to get flung directly at your camera, and it makes your camera get full of stuff quick. So I opted to reverse my direction of my props. So since I'm on the topic, I'll show you the steps in order to do that as a little bonus. We first want to make sure that our motor direction is reversed ticker is switched. So the flight controller is going to operate the motors as if they're reversed. But we also have to make sure that they're reversed in BL-Heli Configurator. So we're going to disconnect from here. We're going to go to the BL-Heli Configurator. We're going to make sure our ESCs are powered up. We're going to go to connect. We're going to do read setup. And if you notice now on each of these settings where it says motor direction, it says reversed. So what you're going to do is they'll be sitting on normal when you first get this. If you want to run it the way I'm running it, you go into BL-Heli Configurator, you read your setup, and you set these from normal to reversed. You set reversed, 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 reversed. And then you're going to do write setup down here, and you click that. And it's going to write that information to the ESCs, and then you can disconnect. And then we can go back to Betaflight and connect. And again, I'm going to unplug my battery. So now back to configuration. So that's basically how to reverse your propellers so that they'll spin, as you see in the picture, they'll spin towards the sides. So therefore, any kind of grass juice you have will end up going into the sides of your quad versus the front and back of your quad. So it keeps it out of the lens. The downside is it can kick it into now your USB port, which is why earlier I mentioned I have a USB plug, and basically I have these little rubber USB plugs. I know you can't see it, so I could just be holding up nothing. But there's actually a USB little plug in my hand here. But I will put a link in the description below where you can pick these up off Amazon. But it's basically just a little rubber plug, and you can stick that in the USB port, and then you don't have to worry about, you know, junk getting in your USB port. So what we're going to do, we'll go down the left column, and then we'll go back up and we'll go down the right column. So that's what this part is here. We just covered that. System configuration. Now, this is essentially how fast do you want the quad to run its error checking. Let's just call it that. I'm not going to get into the technicalities, but how often does it want to check the gyro, and how often do you want it to go through the PID loops? Now, you can see I have these running at maximum speed. I have this all the way at 8 kilohertz, which is the fastest it can go. And I have the PID frequency running at 8 kilohertz, which is the fastest it can go. And why do I have them both running as fast as it can go? Because it's an F4 flight controller. And if you look down here where it says CPU load 6% right here, I know that that's a very comfortable number to be at. Now, if you're running not an F4 controller, you will probably not be able to run both of these at 8 kilohertz, because if you tried to, your CPU load would probably be really high. When it's idle just sitting on the table like this, your CPU load should be, personally, I like to keep it quite low, between 15, 25-ish. And that means that it's doing everything it needs to do sitting here, but it's not actually having to do big calculations while flying. So if you're running like an F3, you might have to lower these values down. Now the PID loop, the second one here, can't be faster than your gyro. So you might have this one at, let's say, 4, and this one now can't go higher than 4, but you may have to run it at 2. That's usually kind of where my F3 boards, depending on the brand, the make, the model, you might end up with a 4 and a 2 kilohertz for the frequencies. And when you save and reboot, and then you look at your, I'm pointing, but you can't see what I'm doing. When you click save and reboot, and then you come back to the screen, you look at your CPU load, it'll probably be at like 15%, 20%, something like that. Being that this is an F4 board, it's a faster board, I can crank these all the way up to 8 kilohertz. And that's exactly where I'm going to keep them, because personally, the faster it does error checking, the faster it gets things done, and I feel like the better it flies. So for the HGLRC XJB 145, if that's what you're flying and you're following along, set them both to 8 kilohertz. It'll work perfectly fine. That's what I fly. You want to make sure your accelerometer is turned on. For level mode and horizon mode, you need the accelerometer, but it also plays a part in some of the other things, like there's some like crash detection, something or other, so it needs the accelerometer on. Turning that off will release some of your processing, so if you are running an F3 board and you want to run the PIDs faster, you can turn off the accelerometer, but then you're sacrificing the information that the accelerometer gives you. I like to leave it on, especially because this is an F4 board. Moving on down, there's no barometer, there's no magnetometer, we leave those off. Personalization, craft name, you can put whatever you want here. What I personally like to do is I like to put the name of the quad. The reason is because it'll show up in the bottom left corner. Well, for me at least, the way I have my OSD set up, it'll show up in the bottom left corner. And when I'm recording DVR footage, that's how I know what quad I'm flying with the DVR footage. But if you're not into that, you can put your name, you can put whatever you want. It's just essentially what it's going to show if you want it to show on your OSD. Other than that, it really doesn't do much. Camera angle, I don't even bother with because it doesn't seem to do much of anything. And now receiver. Now, I went through the whole installation of how to put that Spektrum receiver into my quad, and I actually had one of my viewers have a little bit of an issue because they weren't using the same Spektrum receiver I was using. They were actually using a 3.3 volt receiver. It's very important if you're using a Spektrum receiver that you know whether it's the 3.3 volt or the 5 volt receiver. As wired, when you open this package, there's a red and a black wire. They're set up for the 5 volts. So if you are using a 3.3 volt Spektrum receiver, you will have to move that red wire from the 5 volt pin to the 3.3 volt pin, and it's labeled on the flight controller board as 3V3. So you'll have to move that wire to that other pin and hook it up to your receiver that way. That's a little aside, but just so that in case that comes up in the future, that's how you set that up. So for receiver, since I'm running Spektrum, I'm going to select the serial based, which is where you can see the Spektrum is set up. So we'll click that. And I'm running DSMX. DSMX is the Spektrum 2048. If you happen to be running DSM2, then you're going to want to pick the Spektrum 1024. The DSMX is basically twice the resolution, so you get 2048 resolution on your gimbals. So I'm going to pick 2048. Now, if you're using a different receiver, you're going to come in here, whatever receiver you're using, you're going to pick whatever it is. Most people will be running some form of an S-bus receiver, so you'll probably still be as a serial-based receiver. And when it comes for what you're going to pick what you're going to be using here instead of the Spektrum, whether it's an S-bus receiver, iBus, Crossfire, whatever it is that you have set up, that's what you're going to pick. But I have a Spektrum in here, as you saw in my earlier video. If you want to see how to install the receiver that I installed here, you can check the card in the corner, and it'll show you the video where I do the actual installation. So that's how you set that up. Then we're going to scroll down more. We have some other features here and things I like to turn on. I start off with everything off and I turn on the LED strip because I like to have the LEDs. You may not. You can turn it off and you're not going to hurt my feelings. Air mode. I turn on air mode all the time. What air mode does is essentially it never lets you turn off the motors all the way. It always keeps them in an idle state. That's good when you're doing a lot of acrobatic flying because it keeps you positioned even if you cut your throttle. So if you're doing, let's say, a split S and you punch the throttle up, I know maybe some of you don't even know what a split S is, and I apologize. I'll have to do some videos on some tricks and some terms and some stuff like that. But needless to say, I'll explain it real quick. On a split S, you punch your throttle up, and that makes your quad start going up. You then cut your throttle completely down so you don't have any throttle going, and you flip your quad upside down, because if your quad is upside down and you have throttle, you can imagine if the quad normally flies up with throttle and you turn it upside down and hit the throttle, you will now be accelerating down, and you don't want to do that. So when your quad is upside down, you usually don't want any throttle. What air mode does is it keeps the prop spinning somewhat so you keep in a stable position, because if you turned everything off, it may just start to tumble and fall. With air mode turned on, it keeps whatever position you are, and it just won't accelerate to the ground, but it keeps them spinning, so if it starts to go off kilter, it'll spin up this side to accelerate it to bring it back to where it is, even though you have the throttle all the way down. That's at least how I understand it. That can be completely wrong, but that's at least how it works when I'm flying, and I think that's good enough for me. Again, if you want the real specifics, then you got to go check out other channels like Joshua Bardwell. He gets thorough into what it all means. This is just my interpretation. So I always keep air mode on. The one disadvantage of air mode is when you come into land, you can't just come into land and cut your throttle and you just sit there, because air mode, when you try to land, if you hit the ground, it's going to start bouncing and going kind of wiggy wonky crazy. So you always have to make sure you disarm right before you hit the ground, and that's really the only disadvantage to having air mode on all the time. So that's why I keep air mode on all the time, and you just have to know that you need to flip your disarm right before you land. I have the OSD turned on because I like to have information in my goggles. I have the anti-gravity turned on. What anti-gravity does is essentially on fast throttle punches, it'll temporarily up your PID values to compensate for anything that may happen when you're doing these punch outs. But when you're flying normally, you don't have to be hampered by a high PID. So usually it's good to have it on, and it usually fixes any kind of problems that you would have a punch out. So if you have a punch out and you feel like every time you punch out it pulls to one side, you can just turn on anti-gravity and it should fix the problems with your punch outs. And if not, you can boost up the value of it later, which I'll show you in the PID section. We're not going to talk about tuning PIDs or anything like that. I'm just going to show you where they are and what to change if you want to go that route. That's a whole nother video for a whole nother day. And the dynamic filter, essentially this just kind of helps the quad fly a little bit better. I don't really know what it does. I just know it kind of adjusts the way it filters the noise that the gyros are sensing to the motors so that everything kind of just flies better. I'm leaving it in the hands of the creators to know what they're doing, and I just turn it on. And it seems to work great, so you can choose to turn it on or not if you wish. Down here, it's basically you're just turning on what will cause beeps from the quad. And pretty much I like it to beep me for anything, so it alerts me if there's any kind of issues, problems, or concerns. The only one I turn off is the USB one, and even when I turn it off, half the time it doesn't work, because I don't need it to beep when I'm plugged into USB, but usually it does anyway, so they always end up being on. But I want everything on. But if there's something on here that you don't care about, like if you don't care that your battery is low, you can turn this off and then it won't beep at you when your battery gets low. That's completely up to your discretion. Back to the top here, we'll look at these other things. Now, as long as you're running the latest version of the ESC firmware that we did with the BL-Heli Configurator, you can run DShot 600. I'm not sure what version of the firmware they come out with out of the box, but DShot 600 is what I prefer to fly as my ESC protocol. It's the easiest. It requires no setup. You kind of just turn it on and there you go. So as long as you've updated to the latest firmware that I have, which is at least the 16.7, you're good to go. Put this to DShot 600. And you see here I got my motor stop turned off, because when I arm the quad, I want my motors to spin up. I don't want it to just sit there and not know what's going on. And I have my disarm motors regardless of the throttle value when the arm is configured. So basically my disarm and arm switch functions as a disarm and arm switch. That's why I have that turned on. And the motor idle throttle value, this is essentially, you can adjust this. I leave it at the default, but it's essentially where, remember I said it's going to, when you go to 0 throttle on your stick, it's still going to keep the motors idling. Here is where you can set that percent value of the idle, and you could actually hook this up and adjust it so that it's either just before it takes off or just, you know, it's a personal preference. This was the stock value it came out with when I set it up originally, and I haven't touched it, and it flies great. So if you're flying this exact quad, I see no reason why you can't just leave it at 4.5, which is what mine put as the default. There you go. But it's essentially just what percentage of the full value is it going to spin the motors when it's idle. Board and sensor alignment, you don't have to worry about because you didn't build this, and the board is centered and aligned correctly. It's pointing forward and it's laying horizontal. This would be if you were building your own and for whatever reason you put the flight controller on end, you'd have to say, well, the flight controller is this way in relation to the quad, or it's this way in relation to the quad, or it's this way in relation. So it's basically just how is the flight board oriented compared to the frame of the quad itself. But since it's flat and pointing forward, you can leave them all at 0. The accelerometer trim, basically what I like to do is after I get everything set up, I put the quad into horizon mode or level mode, or basically just some way so that it'll auto level itself. And I do a hover test where I'm hovering a couple feet off of the ground, line of sight, not FPV. And I just see if the quad's pulling any particular direction when it thinks it's level. Now, yes, you could trim that out using the trims on your receiver or the sub trims or whatever like that, but I prefer to do it in the flight controller so that way my transmitter is basically zeroed and it's compensating for that within the quad. So as you can see, the roll which is left and right, when I originally set this up, it seemed to be pulling slightly to the left. So I added some roll trim because positive would be pulling it to the right. So by having 2 worth of roll, it kind of didn't have any pull. It would drift. It's not gonna just sit in one spot. It will drift around, but it may drift to the right, and then you'll hit left a little bit, and it'll drift back to, and it'll keep going left, and then you drift to the right. But this was, I would correct it, and it would go back, and I would correct it, and it would go back. So that's why I added a little bit of roll trim just to get it to not have any pull in any particular direction. You can leave them at 0. You can, instead of trimming it on in Betaflight, you can do it with your little trims on the transmitter itself. It's completely up to you. This is just the way I do it. RSSI signal we don't have to worry about. We're not running a 3D quad, and we don't have GPS. So that's the end for the Configuration tab. Next, we'll go down to Power and Battery. And basically, I didn't touch anything here. So I just left this all as the onboard stuff, and I left these. I may have adjusted these a little bit because the minimum cell voltage, I think I moved it down a notch or 2. Basically, when you do punch outs, you are going to get a battery sag, a voltage sag. Essentially, your voltages will drop, but then after you finish the punch out, they'll come right back up. So if you don't lower this a little bit, your quad's just always going to be beeping at you, and it's always going to say low voltage warning unless you have a really good battery with a high C rating. I'm flying it around, like I say, I'm always flying it with those 3S packs that are 45C, which is not ideal. Ideally, you'd want something that's like a 75C or maybe even a 95C, and it just means that those batteries can discharge more power quicker, so you won't get those battery sags. Because anytime the voltage sags, remember, that's loss of power, which means your motors aren't spinning as fast as they could. So the more power your battery can deliver as quickly as possible, the better the quad will fly. But even with my 45C 3S packs that I'm flying on it, because it can go up to a 4S. What failsafe is essentially what will the quad do when it loses the connection with your transmitter, be it got turned off, be it a lost signal, be it whatever reason, it doesn't know what you want to command it to do. So the failsafe is what should it do. And essentially what they have is they have it set up here, and the way I have it configured is a 2-stage failsafe. And the meat and the potatoes of this, feel free to copy this down, but essentially is when it detects a failsafe, meaning the flight controller goes, uh-oh, no one's telling me what to do. So that's what this first part is saying here, is that if the pulses from my transmitter go below this number or above this number, then it's saying something's not right. What should I do? Well, what you should do is for your throttle, your aux1, your aux2, your aux3, roll, pitch, yaw, throttle, what should I do with these values? What should I change them to? So the way I configure it is as such. Roll, pitch, yaw, I set to auto. And as you can see, that basically means it's going to go center. So rolling, pitching, and yawing, it'll bring all the commands to center. So it'll stop rolling, it'll stop pitching, it'll stop rolling. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to come back to level. It just means if you were rolling and you were like this and it loses connection, it's going to stay like this. It's not going to continue to roll. It's not going to continue to pitch. It's not going to go into an auto level. It just means it's going to stop doing all those commands as if your sticks went to center. The throttle stick, however, I have set to hold. And the reason is because if it basically, the throttle, its auto is to go to 0, which would cut all the engines. Now, there may be a slight chance within a little bit of time that you'll regain that signal. If you hold your throttle, that means the quad will stay wherever it is for that short period of time and perhaps regain that signal from your transmitter. That's where stage 2 comes in. And you can see here, we have the fail-safe kill switch. I have that turned on. So basically, I have a switch that's basically a kill switch. It's also my arm switch. When I move it to the opposite position, it's a kill switch. Boom, cuts everything, drops it out of the sky. Also, the guard time. I have it set to 5. 5 stands for 0.5 seconds or a half a second. So that means even if I'm doing a full-on punch-out and I'm full throttle, the quad is going to hold that full throttle for a half a second before dropping out of the sky. And I'm pretty comfortable letting it do that because a half a second is not enough time for anyone to get hurt or anything to happen, but it's enough time that I might regain control of the quad, which is a lot better than losing control of the quad and having it crash. So that's why I have it set to hold for the throttle, but I have it guard for a half a second. Now, that's the way I set it up, and that by no means is the right way or the wrong way or what you should do. These are choices that you should make. You may want to set your throttle to auto and have it just the minute there's no commands, boom, it falls. You may want to set your guard shorter. You may want to set your guard longer. I think a half a second is a good balance of hoping to get the signal back, but not being so that it's just flying by itself, off it goes, fly away into the wild blue yonder. So the fail-safe throttle low delay point is basically if your throttle is down for, basically I have it set for 10 seconds to disarm the quad. Essentially what this is you flew into a tree or you crashed and you forgot to hit your disarm switch and it's still trying to fly, but you were smart enough to drop your throttle to the down position, but you forgot to disarm. It's going to say, I haven't tried to fly in 10 seconds, so I'll disarm myself. So that's why I said 10 seconds is a good enough amount of time that you're not going to really damage anything if they're spinning. I mean, you can damage something if they're spinning, but I mean, you're not going to burn anything out. But it's enough that it's not going to trip while you're doing flight or tricks, because you're never going to put your throttle for 10, unless you're a mile in the sky, you're never going to drop your throttle to 0 for 10 seconds in flight for it to disarm itself, essentially. And lastly, the fail-safe procedure, and you should always pick drop, not land. Because land, you really just don't want this quad flying on its own, because that's when it can end up flying into someone, hurting someone. You can kill a kitten. So you essentially want it to drop. So if it gets to a fail-safe stage 2, it should just fall out of the sky. So that's why you have drop selected, and that's when it's just going to drop out of the sky. So then you click your save and reboot. Again, feel free to copy my settings. PID tuning. Subject of a whole different video, and I'm not going to get into it now, but I'm just going to tell you this is where you would do all your PID tuning if you want to do it within Betaflight. There's lots of videos about it. There's lots of videos. It's very intimidating. I plan on doing a video at some point soon with my take on it, my explanation on it, my kind of easy way I think of doing it, but it's not great, but at least it gets you tuned, because I'm still beginning. But if you're watching this, you're probably a beginner too, so you'd probably be interested. But that's for another day, another time. Essentially, here's where you do all your tunings. You have your proportionals, your integrals, your derivatives, which stands for P, I, D. For your roll, your pitch, and your yaw. So these are where everyone talks about PIDs. These are the numbers everyone's talking about. You also have your rates and your super rates. These basically determine how fast your quad rotates and spins and stuff like that. There's all other kinds of settings in here that you can play with. Also, I mentioned earlier about the anti-gravity. And if you're having problems where you do punch outs and the quad seems to always pull a certain way when you punch with your throttle, this is where you have your anti-gravity gain. And here's where it's set to 1. If you use anti-gravity and you still get those when you pull it, when you throttle punch, and I keep saying throttle punch, you're basically flooring it, whatever you want to say, but you're moving the stick all the way to the top and then coming all the way down. That's a punch where you go like, woo! I'm not doing that sound effect again. If it still does what the artifact that you don't like, if it pulls to one side or pitches forward or something, you can set this to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And you just keep raising that up until that goes away. That's where you would tune that out. And then under receiver, I don't have my receiver turned on, but I will do that right now so I can demonstrate what we want to do. So after your receiver's been bound to this, and the binding procedure is really kind of simple. So while I'm talking about the binding procedure, let's do that right now. So with this quad, the receiver is not powered up when you have the USB plugged in. You do have to attach your battery for your receiver to get power. So I will do that again. Now my receiver is getting power, and I will turn on my transmitter. And you'll see now with my transmitter on, I can wiggle the sticks. And as I wiggle the sticks, you'll start to see stuff happening. Now, the one thing I am noticing that's kind of interesting is my profile on this is needs a little bit of adjusting, which is actually really good that we're seeing this, because my profile is not trimmed out. Because with my sticks centered, I'm not touching anything. Well, the throttle can be at the bottom. Without anything happening, you notice this demonstrational model of the quad is drifting a little bit. And if you notice, my sticks, they should be at 1500 on all three of these, should say 1500, but they're not. So there's ways to adjust those. You can adjust those using your trims, but I prefer to adjust those using the sub trims inside the transmitter. So I'm going to go in and alter my sub trims on the DX6 on this model. You basically just click to go into the menu. I'm going to go into control setup, and then I'm showing the travel. The travel I can check because I want it to go from about 1,000 to about 2,000. You see that's where I am on my yaw. My throttle's from 999 to about 2,000, and my roll is from about 999 to 2,000, and my pitch is a little low to is about good. So my pitch, I can adjust the travel of my pitch. The down part, I want to bring that up a little bit. There we go. Okay. So essentially, I'm just adjusting the travel of my gimbal so that I have between 1,000 and 2,000 travel. Now I'm going to go into my sub trim, and it shows my roll is a little wrong. So let me adjust that. 1,500. So I had to add 2 to the left for roll. My pitch needed 1 up for the pitch. And let's see here, my yaw. Yaw needed to the left 2. So essentially I just set the different trims on my gimbals so that it's now centered. And if you notice now, I'm not doing any commands on my transmitter. And now in Betaflight, it's showing 1,500 for all 3 stick positions, for the yaw, the roll, and the pitch, which is what you want, because you may have drift, you may have it always pulling to one side and you can't figure it out. Well, it may be just that things aren't centered on your transmitter. So now I can see visually everything centered, and now if you notice, the preview of my quad is just sitting still. So that's how you center your sticks using subtrim and travel. Little extra double bonus. The other thing is, if you're running Spektrum, you're going to want to make sure your transmitter map is set to the Spektrum, which means it's basically going to be throttle, roll, or aileron, which is like a plane term, but we call it roll. E, which is your elevator, which is pitch for us. And R, which is rudder, but it's yaw for us as quad flyers. but that's where the why it has roll is A, pitch is E, yaw is R, and T is T. But it's basically just what order does the transmitter transmit them in. If you use FR Sky, it's going to be a different order. If you use a different transmitter, you may have to adjust. You can just type them in yourself, but essentially it just means the first channel 1 is throttle, channel 2 is your roll, channel 3 is your pitch, channel 4 is your yaw, channel 5 is aux 1, aux 2, aux 3, and aux 4. It's basically just saying which channels or which signals so that it functions properly. Then you have basically your low, your mid, and your high. So I have my low stick being at 1050, my mid stick to be 1500, and my high stick to be 1900. I'm basically tightening up the ends a little bit, so there's a little bit of play at the bottom end and a little bit of play at the top end, and the center is still the center for what the valid values are for my stick positions. And the rest of this you can just leave as is. And if you look down here, it's also showing you, so if you like move your sticks around, it shows you that you're moving your sticks around. And that's all that little graph is on the bottom showing you. And then you'd hit save. Modes. What modes are is essentially how you set up your switches on your transmitter of whatever you happen to have. So you need to have an ARM switch. You need to have, if you want, a mode select switch, and maybe a beeper. There's a couple things you can set up. So I'll tell you how I have mine set up. Mine is set up so that these two switches are my aux 1 and aux 2. This is aux 2 on my right, and this is aux 1 that's on my left switch. And the way this works is my left-hand switch I have for being what flight mode I'm in. And the right side I have to basically be arming, disarming, fail-safing, beeper, all that kind of stuff. So I'll show you how that works. So first, the arm switch. Now, I want to be very careful not to arm my quad because it is powered with a battery right now, and my props are on. So I want to make sure I don't accidentally arm it. However, I can show you the disarm beeper and the not. So the way this works is, if you notice, there's a little dash here, and it's showing I'm using the aux 2 switch. So when I flip the switch to the back position, you see that switch moves to here. And since this is monitoring aux 2 for beeper, it moves back to here. And if I move it up, you see the aux 2 switch is now in the center position. Same thing for aux 1. Right now I have it in the high position. If I move it to the middle position, it moves to here. And if I put it in the low position, it puts it to here. So essentially the way it works is each of these switches are a 3-position switch. And whatever position it is in will determine what it does. So for the arm switch, if I was to push the switch all the way to the forward position, that switch is going to go into this zone between this spot, and that will designate I wish to arm the copter. In the middle position, as far as arm goes, is nothing, and as far in the low position, which is over here, means nothing. So if aux 2 is over here somewhere, arm the copter, and that's how I have it configured. Angle, which would be your full self-level mode, I don't have configured, and you'll see why in a little bit. Then horizon mode, which is the self-leveling but still lets you do flips if you really pull the sticks to the edges. It will let you flip. It doesn't have an actual angle limitation, but it will level yourself out. So if I go into that mode, that would be moving aux 1 to the middle position. And you see, because that dash is inside this zone, it's now lit up saying that the quad recognizes it's in horizon mode. So if you wish to set that up, you configure what position you want the switch in, and you put the bar where you want it to be. If you wanted to set up an angle mode, you would just do add range, and you could say, let's say you wanted to put in this lower position here. Well, you see the switch means it's here. I can take this part, put it like that. So now when the switch is here, it'll be an angle, and when the switch is here, it would be in horizon. If I click save, you'll see now, when it's in this position, angle. When it's in this position, it's in horizon. So depending on where this notch is will depend on what mode it's in. But I don't want angle, so I'm going to turn that button back off. Hey, this is Tronage from the future. I'm just going to pause it here for one moment. I realized as I'm editing this footage that I don't talk about acro mode or air mode as some people call it. And there's no actual spot to turn on an air mode. You have angle mode, you have horizon mode, and in a little bit of the video you're going to see where I talk about a turtle mode or after a crash mode. But you notice there's no acro mode. And essentially the way you activate acro mode is you have no other modes turned on. So what I do is on my aux1 switch, if you saw earlier, I have it in the high position. When it's in the high position, the horizon mode is not activated because it needs to be in the middle position. In a little bit, and I talk about turtle mode, you'll see that's when my switch is in the low position, that gets activated. But when the switch is in the high position, nothing gets turned on because angle is not defined, horizon is not turned on, and turtle mode won't be turned on. So when the flight controller has no other modes turned on, then it resorts to being in acro or air mode as some call it. So that's how you get into air mode, is you basically don't have any other modes defined for the switch position that you're at. Hope that is not as confusing as I think that may be, but I hope that clears up how to get into acro mode. We'll go down here, the beeper. I have the beeper set up, so on the same switch I use to arm, if I flip it the other direction, I get my beeper. That way I know if I'm ever disarming, chances are I'm going to want a beeper because I'm either disarming because I'm landing or I'm disarming because I crashed. If I disarm because I landed, I'm going to and then I can turn it off and go to that middle position on the switch. If I'm in a tree or I crash, it'll disarm and I'll be able to hear the beeper to find the quad. I then also have my failsafe. If you notice, same as the beeper. That's my failsafe. So if I flip that, it's cutting the quad. That's my kill switch. It's going to drop it out of the sky. Cuts off everything, so I know if I need to stop it, when I hit that, it's going to stop, and it's going to start beeping so I can locate where it is. The last thing I have here is this flip over after crash mode. And this is why I don't have a level mode set up on my quad. If I put the switch into the first position, it goes into the flip over after crash mode. And what this mode does is when you arm the quad, you don't use this to fly. You use this to either flip your quad over if it's like on its back, or you can use it to kind of wiggle yourself out of a tree if you're tangled up in a tree. And the way it works is you go into this mode, you arm it like you're going to fly, but then instead of flying, your pitch and your roll stick will instead just individually operate the 4 props. So if you try to pitch, it's going to try to pitch forward or back. If you try to yaw, if you try to roll, it's going to try to roll back and forth, but spinning the props the reverse direction. So if it's upside down and you try to roll, instead of it trying to roll down, it'll roll back over. The downside is, since we're running reversed props, and if you're upside down in the grass, when you're doing this, used to be called turtle mode, spinning the props backwards so it can flip over means that it's now spinning the props the reverse of our reverse, which means it's back to being like the normal way because I'm running it weird, remember, from the beginning? And it means now you're going to fling dirt into the camera lens because you're upside down, you're in the grass, and now you're going to spin the props. So, really, let's see if I can safely do this. Okay, I'm in turtle mode now. If I hit to the left, you see it just turns on those props a little bit. If I hit to the right, it turns those back and forward. And the object is to try to flip itself over. The rule of thumb I figured out is the only way I can keep this prop and this prop from spinning and kicking stuff into that lens is I can only use the back. If I can't get myself flipped over by pulling back like that, I'm probably not going to have a good experience, because anything else is going to fling something into that lens. And even if I do get flipped back over onto the right way, I'm not going to be able to fly. However, I leave this mode turned on because being able to do that while it's stuck in a tree can make the difference of getting it to fall out of the tree. So it gives you a way to wiggle yourself around, but it's essentially just spinning the props backwards in an attempt to flip yourself over if you happen to be this way and you do it. You can see it wants to flip itself back over. So that's what that mode does. So I like to have that mode turned on. And then you just hit save, and that's how it saves those modes. Adjustments tab. I've never done a single thing on this tab ever. To be honest, I don't really even know what it does, but I don't think it's really necessary for this quad or what we're doing, so we can skip it. Servos, never touched it, don't know what it does, we'll skip it. Motors. This is essentially where you can troubleshoot motors, make sure your motors are spinning the correct way, things like that. But essentially, this lets you spin your motors at a defined speed under controlled circumstances, and you should always, always, always have your props removed from the quad. That's why it says down here, remove your propellers. It's written in red right here, and it won't let you do anything at all. You can't move any of these switches unless you click this thing on saying you agree to it, because it doesn't want you to accidentally spin it up with your props on. And my props are on, and I'm not going to worry about it because I'm not going to turn this on. I'm not going to show you. But needless to say, you turn this on, it lets you spin up your props and troubleshoot. You can spin them up real slow. You can adjust the dials, and you can make sure things are spinning the correct way. But if you go to use this, take your props off. You do not want to have any kind of injury. OSD. What OSD does is this lets you configure what you're going to see in your goggle. Okay. Now, the camera on the XJB is a PAL camera, so it's going to configure it. You can leave it as auto, but it's really going to be the PAL format. But I leave it as auto. But you can see this is the viewing area that you would see in your goggles. The logo you can turn on and off. It doesn't matter. Just you don't see a logo here, but you're not. It doesn't matter whether it shows it or not. You can see here, it does not change. Where does it say? There. Doesn't matter whether it's going to show. It tells you a little story there. So you can. I just turn it off because I don't need it in the way of seeing what I'm trying to do. Now this is the way I have mine configured. You can follow it if you wish and have the same view that I have, or you can come up with your own. But you have certain things that you can turn on and off here along the left side, and then you can position where you want them on the screen by dragging and dropping them. So the main battery voltage, I have that right here. And you see as you hover over it, it makes it light up on the left side. This is the total voltage of my battery. I then have to the right here, I have the average cell voltage. So this is if you take the main battery voltage and divide, like if I'm running a 3S, it'll take the main and divide it by 3. I like that because I fly a lot of various quads. I fly 2S, I fly 3S, and I fly 4S. It's difficult in the heat of the moment while flying for me to look at a total battery voltage and say, oh, I should come in for a landing that's kind of a, a good voltage to come in on. What I like is I like having that average battery voltage because I know a fully charged pack is 4.2 volts per cell, and I know a storage voltage is 3.8 volts per cell, and I know while I'm flying around, if I'm at around 3.6 or so, when I land, it should rebound up to about 3.7, 3.8, so I'll be landing at a storage voltage, so I won't take much to do my batteries at the end to put them in storage, so I use that as sort of my guide. So whether I'm flying a 2S, a 3S, or a 4S pack, I don't have to remember anything. I just have to remember those same values for the average cell value. So if I start seeing 3.8s as my average, then I'm like, okay, we're starting to get where we're going to be coming in for landing soon. If I see it around 3.6 or so, I know I should definitely be landing soon. And it's just basically a gas gauge, and it's the way I prefer to do it. You can do it however you wish. That's what works for me. Below that, I have basically my warning indicator, which will tell me why there's any kind of beeping or information or anything that's going on with the quad. It'll tell me right there by my batteries, so I know what's going on there. Here I have whether it's disarmed or armed, and I like it kind of centered, because when I look in my goggles, I'll know it'll say disarmed. When I flip it to armed, it'll say armed, and then it goes away. So this way I know whether I'm in a disarmed or an armed state. I like the center crosshair. It basically just puts this little thing in the center. It just makes it easier for when you're trying to aim things, going through race gates, doing moves, doing turns, orbiting things. It just gives you a reference point of what's center, and it makes it a little easier to do stuff, in my opinion. Again, its choice is yours. And then in the bottom left, I have three things. I have how long I've been flying, which again I use also as an indicator for battery life. I know on this quad I'm going to have about a 3-minute flight time. So I look at my average voltage, and I can look at my flight time that I've had on the flight, and I know based on those two when I should land. I also have a third thing, the timer that I have on my transmitter set at 3 minutes, so it's giving me audio warnings as well. I'll have the visual of the timer in my OSD. The next thing I have down here is I have the flight mode that I'm in. This way, in case this switch gets bumped while I'm transporting my radio and I put it on when I'm doing my pre-flight check, I just take a glance over there and make sure I'm going to be in air mode, since I'm going to be flying in air mode. So I just make sure it says air. If it says anything else, I know I have to flip that switch. And lastly, I have the name of the craft name, they call it. And that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's wherever you put in that field at the beginning under configuration. Whatever you put here under the personalization is what's going to appear here if you use craft name. And again, I use that for when I'm looking at my DVR footage. I can immediately know what craft is flying this DVR footage. And that's how I have my OSD set up. You can also turn on the horizon sidebars. I see a lot of people use those, so you can get an idea whether you're pitching forward, back. You use those in conjunction with the artificial horizon. So if the horizon is lined up with these arrows, your quad is theoretically level. And as you move forward, the horizon would rise, and as you pitch back, the horizon would fall. You know, you can play around with these things, see if you like them. I find them to be a little bit more of a distraction, and the only thing I like is the center dot, some information about my batteries and warnings, fly time, mode, craft name. That's all I find I need. But feel free to turn any or all of these on and play around with them, see what you like in your OSD. On the right side here, I want my units in Imperial. Doesn't really matter much because that's more if you have like a GPS logging, whether it be like miles per hour, kilometers per hour, things like that. Timers, you can do the on time and the total armed time. On time is essentially when the battery plugs in, starts a timer. Total armed time is when you arm it and you're flying, how long that timer is. So those are the two timers that you can have set up for these timers. So I have this one just set up as timer 2, which is the total armed time. But if I wanted to, I could also turn on a timer 1. And this one, let's say I wanted to put it right here next to that one. This would be how long has the battery been plugged in, which is the on time. And this would be how long I've been flying with it being armed. But I used to run with both of these just like this, but I found the second one to be a little distracting because it doesn't really matter how long the battery's been plugged on. It's more about how long you've been flying. So I've since turned that one off just to try to clean up my OSD a little bit more. When you first start flying, you want everything on there. And then as you start flying more, you start taking things away. Like I might start removing this voltage because I never look at it. I'm really only looking at this one because I fly so many different voltages that I don't want to remember, wait, is this flying the 2S or the 3S? Is this? So it's just easier that it standardizes all my voltages regardless of what battery I'm flying. it's going to be the same set of numbers for all the quads. So I just find that easier for me. So I might be turning this one off very soon. And, you know, maybe even turning off the mode switch, because my pre-flight could just be check the switch on the controller instead of looking at the OSD, just to start to clean it up a little bit more. Alarms, not really necessary, because, you know, you should be just monitoring everything that you're doing. And then the post-flight statistics, when you hit disarm, it'll just show you some statistics about the flight. Since there's really not much on this quad to show, it's not going to show much. So I just have it, well, how low did the minimum battery go, just to get an idea of how much voltage sag I've had. The black box will show you how much black box is remaining. This is important if you're doing tuning and you want to make sure that you're recording your information to the black box, that you say, oh, my black box is full and I thought I was doing a tune. You know you've run out of space. So I just like to have an indication of how much black box space is remaining. And we'll talk about black box when we get over here to it. I have it show timer 2, how long that basically that flight was, and the black box log number. So if it was logging it right in the video, it'll tell me what log number it is. So later on I can match up the log and the video so that I know which goes with which a little easier. LED strip. This one's super easy. This quad only has 2 LEDs. So it has 2 LEDs, one on the left and one on the right. It's really easy to set up these LEDs. The gist of it is, if you get it and these are not already set up, they should already be set up. Mine was. But if they're not, it's really simple. I'll just show you. You go into wire ordering mode, and where these 2 are, you'd click. I'll just do 2 down here for demonstration purposes, but pretend I'm clicking here. So you would just do this and you do that. And you see it put a 2 and it put a 3. Well, it would put a 0 and it put a 1, just like it's up here. It's thinking now I'm saying there's 2 more LEDs, but we're just doing that for demonstration. And then you turn off wiring mode. Now I have 2 LEDs sitting here. And you can set up those LEDs to do whatever you want to do. What I like to do is I like to have them, you click one, hold for Windows, you'd hit Control, and you click the other so that you have them both highlighted. I like to turn them to color. I like to turn them to the Larson scanner. And as you see, they're starting to look like this. That's what these are looking like. I like them to be indicators, which now will put the little yellow dots in the corner like I have up here. And what that means then, actually I'll tell you what that means in 1 second, because I have to set this one to be on the right side and this one on the left side. Basically now if I go to turn right, this one blinks like a right turn blinker. If I go to turn left, this one turns left like a left turn blinker. And then you can set what color you want it to be for the Larson scanner. So I'll click them, and let's say I want it to be, you know, teal, or I can just leave it as 0, or I can make it be blues, or whatever you want it to be. Essentially what the Larson scanner does is just like old school Knight Rider, like woo woo, woo woo, and goes back and forth. With 2 LEDs, it kind of looks a little lame. It just kind of blinks a little bit. But I like that better than just a solid color. It also keeps them a little dimmer, so it's not so bright, but it still is kind of bright. I don't know. Feel free to play with it, see what it does, experiment with it, get it the way you like it. This is all subjective. It doesn't affect the flight of the quad at all. It's really just what you like. And this is how I have mine set up. But if you want to see how I have mine set up, this is how I have my left one set up. Set up as color, Larson scanner, indicator, to the west, and starting with color 0. And same thing on here, but this one's pointing to the east. And that's just how I have my 2 LEDs configured. Under sensors, this is really more for troubleshooting, but it'll just show you what's going on in your quad right now. So you see it's just sitting there, so it's not getting any information. If I pick up the quad and start moving it around, you see now things start doing. So that's just to see for troubleshooting. Not really much to set up with that. Tethered logging I've never used before, so I don't know what it does. My guess is it's basically you're tethered, but you're logging, maybe like Blackbox, but you have the wire attached to it. But I don't know how you would fly with the wire attached, so I've never played with it. I don't know what it does, so we can skip it. Blackbox. Now, what Blackbox is doing is when you're flying, it's going to store what your flight was into some onboard memory on the quad. Needless to say, what it does is it's recording what your RC command is, like what you're doing with your sticks, as well as recording the gyro, like what's the position of the quad, and it's also recording what the PIDs are doing, how is it trying to correct things. So it makes tuning it a little better because you can fine tune, you can see if there's any kind of oscillations that you may have not noticed, and you can see what you need to tune. And it also helps you if something you're like, well, why did I just fall out of the sky? You can go back and look at the black box and see if there's any indication. Was it because you lost a connection and you had a failsafe? Was it because a motor burnt out? Was it, what happened? So you can use it for different things like that. Now, you're going to have to, it may set up to be no logging when you first purchase this, but you're going to want to change to onboard flash because this particular quad, the HGLRC XJB 145, does have onboard logging to data flash chip. So you can turn that to onboard flash. And I actually am going to drop this. I was recording at 2 kilohertz, but I'm going to drop it down to 1 kilohertz because 2 kilohertz is a little bit overkill for what I'm doing. And I don't have much flash space because it's an onboard flash. There's only 16 megs. If I was recording to a serial port, or if it had a some flight controllers have an SD card that's on it that's recording the black box data to, then you can record more. But this doesn't record much, and 1 kilohertz is a pretty good amount of data to store for doing tuning. So because at 2 kilohertz, it was sort of filling my black box up after like 1 or 2 flights, and that's really not enough for doing real tuning sessions. So I'm going to drop that down to a 1 kilohertz. As far as what happens to that data, well, it'll just fill up. This is showing that my data flash chip is filled with black box data. Now, unfortunately, it's not the first in, first out. It doesn't keep, the old stuff gets removed and the new stuff is what's saved. No. It basically just fills up and then stops recording. So it doesn't affect your flights at all, so you can just keep flying and flying and flying and flying. However, when you want to make sure you're recording it, then you're going to go either into your OSD or into Betaflight, and you're going to want to erase your flash. So I'll do that here. I'm going to erase the flash, yes, erase the data flash, and what it's doing right now, it's going to clear out my data flash. So the very next time that I go to fly, when I arm it, it'll actually have room to record, and it'll record the black box data. I'll be able to synchronize that to a video that I record through the DVR or through the Mobius Mini. And then using the two of those pieces of information, the black box and the video, I can begin to analyze a tune and adjust it. And that's how I'm going to tune the 4S packs onto here and try to remove those oscillations. Now you can see it does take a long time. The data flash is not fast by no means. And I know I already erased it, but if I wanted to save that information so I could use it later in the black box analyzer, that's where you would click here, the save flash to file, and it'll pull the data flash information out and put it on a file so you can analyze it using the black box analyzer. And lastly, the CLI, which we already talked about in the beginning. This basically lets you put in some commands, let you take out some commands, let you see what's set up, see what's going on. The other thing, what you can do with it, like for binding, for example, I know I posted this in the comments and I know you can find it elsewhere, but essentially if you want to do binding with Spektrum receivers, you can use the Spektrum commands in the CLI, and I always forget what they are. So one trick you can use is the command get. So you can do get, and I know that the commands for Spektrum start with SPEK. So I can just do get SPEK, and when I hit enter, it's going to show me all of the things that have SPEK in them. So you can see the SPEK TRM sat bind equals 0, and it tells you the allowed range. And then the Spektrum set bind auto reset is set to off. So these are the two things that you'd want to be playing with to start to turn your satellite receiver into bind mode. And essentially what you would do to do that is you would type set Pektrum underscore sat underscore bind equals 9, and you'd hit enter. Then you would type save, but I'm not going to hit enter, but you'd hit save, and that's going to save it. So that's going to say put it into bind mode. If you're using a DSM2, not DSMX, but DSM2 receiver, I believe you want to set it to bind equals 10. But for a DSMX receiver, you're going to use bind 9. Then you're going to click save. Then you want to remove all power from the quad. Be it a battery, be it your USB cable, everything. So after you hit save and you hit enter and it does its thing, remove all power from the quad. Then put power to the quad, be it a battery or USB, whatever you need to do to turn on your transmitter. So for this quad particular, you do have to plug a battery in. The USB port does not power the receiver. Plug a battery in. You should see the little yellow light on the receiver start blinking very quick. That means it's now in bind mode. For the Spektrum transmitters, as long as you have your profile set up inside, you click your bind button and turn it on. And it should then form the bind. Not going to get into the details of this because this is more for Betaflight, but while we're here, I figured I'd just show you the quick process of how to do the bind with the quad with the Spektrum. And that's pretty much my process of going through and editing and configuring and setting up this quad. Now typically what I'll do at this point, now that I have everything configured the way I want it to be set up, I would then do another dump, and then I would save that to a file. This way I have my stock from the factory settings saved as a file, and then I have my settings set up saved to a file. And that way I can always go between them or everything like that. What I like about that is, let's say now I get another quad and I like this OSD settings. I don't have to go in and manually set it up. I can just go over here, find the OSD part here, set OSD, set OSD. I can just grab this part that says the set OSD stuff, take that, and then I can plug in my other quad, whatever it is, let's say, and I can just go over here and hit paste and hit enter. And there it would send all those OSD settings to the new quad. So now the new quad is set up with these OSD settings. So I don't have to go through and turn them all on. And that's why every single quad I run looks the same, because I just take that same set of settings, send it to the quad, and boom, it puts all the stuff exactly where I have it. So everything's the same from quad to quad to quad. So as you can see, going through this is really simple. Wasn't too scary. Hope I took you through step by step. Kind of tried to explain what things were, generalized without getting too technical, and if you copied my settings, you should be able to get up and flying no problem. So hope that helped you out. Once again, my name is Tronage. May all your flights not end in a crash. Take care. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, you really should subscribe. I'm always posting new content. If you'd like to help support the channel and get access to giveaways, raffles, and other exclusive benefits, consider joining the Tronage family on the Patreon page. Here's some videos that you might be interested in. This is the latest one that I posted, and this one I think you might just like. Go check them out.